Hey, you guys, Miss Morell here with your recap of warm-up questions for the week. The first five for the week were previous material to kind of get this stuff back in your brains a little bit. So let's get started. Number one says, a group of students are investigating the transformation of energy during digestion. The initial temperature, and that means the beginning temperature, of hydrogen peroxide in a beaker is measured and recorded. Small pieces of liver are placed into a beaker of hydrogen peroxide, and the temperature is measured and recorded every 30 seconds over a 2-minute time period. What energy transformation is under investigation in this scenario above? So the liver would represent food. The hydrogen peroxide would represent digestive juices and acids in your mouth and stomach. So we're modeling digestion here. And by measuring the temperature, we're checking to see if the chemical energy stored in the bonds of the food molecules gets converted into thermal energy. We should see a rise in temperature because we know that one of the byproducts of digestion is the production of thermal energy. So the correct answer to this question would be B, chemical energy transformed into thermal energy. Number two, what can you infer from the fact that the disappearance of just one species can disrupt an entire food chain? We talked a lot about this. This is biodiversity. We learned that the more biodiversity an ecosystem has, the more stable it is, the more sustainable it is. The opposite of that is the less biodiversity it has, like a food chain, the more fragile it is. So if you remove one species, the entire chain collapses. So 2 is C. Food chains are extremely fragile. Number 3, which of the following is true about ecological succession? So if you'll remember, ecological succession is the predictable order of events that an ecosystem undergoes while it's reestablishing itself after a disruption. There are 2 kinds of ecological succession, primary and secondary, and the difference is soil. If there's no soil after the disruption, then it's primary succession. If there is soil, then it's secondary succession. But regardless of what kind of succession it is, succession, at the end of that process, you have what's called a climax community, and that climax community sees stable populations. So there's equilibrium, there's balance in the ecosystem. So succession leads to equilibrium in an ecosystem. Number 4, warm-blooded animals maintain a constant body temperature by converting. So what energy conversion takes place? This is the same as question number 1. They convert chemical energy stored in food, not to electrical energy, but to thermal energy. That's how they maintain their body temperature, is those chemical reactions. One of the byproducts is thermal energy. So chemical energy is converted into thermal energy. And number 5, what percentage of energy would make it from the producers to the tertiary consumers? So if you were to draw a pyramid and have 100% of the energy at the producer level, only 10% of that energy moves up through the levels. So the first level consumers, or the herbivores, the primary consumers, 10% of 100 is 10. So they would only have 10% of the energy. The second level consumers, or carnivores, 10% of 10 is 1. So they would only have 1% of the original 100% of energy. And then third level consumers, or the omnivores, 10% of 1 is 0.1. So there would only be 1/10 of 1% available to the tertiary consumers. So number 5 was D, 1/10 of 1%. Now let's go on to the Wednesday, Thursday questions. Here we go. Number 1, hurricanes frequently form over the oceans during warmer months of the year. What conditions lead to the formation of hurricanes? Now, we hadn't really talked about this when we gave you these warm-up questions, but we did then have conversations about what hurricanes need to form. And what every hurricane must have is warm water. So that warm water, that heat, that thermal energy is trapped in the water, and that causes high amounts of evaporation, which causes more moisture in the air, which lowers air pressure, forming a low pressure center. And you'll learn in 8th grade that low pressure equals unstable atmosphere. So the air starts moving and it draws inward on itself in a spiraling motion. So the key to the formation of the hurricane always is heat, warm water. So number 1 was B. Heat combined with high evaporation of moisture lowers air pressure, forming a low pressure center that draws wind inward in a spiraling motion. Number 2, which of these would not be caused by a thunderstorm? Well, we're all very familiar with thunderstorms, living where we live, and we know that sometimes they cause flash floods. A lot of times you see lightning. Sometimes thunderstorms can cause tornadoes because the same conditions that cause a thunderstorm, which means pressure differential like between high and low pressure areas, also spawn tornadoes. What you don't see, though, typically with a thunderstorm is a storm surge. Storm surges are much more commonly associated with hurricanes, a longer term, bigger storm. So number 2 is C, storm surge. Number 3, where do hurricanes form? Well, we just talked about how the only fuel a hurricane needs is warm water. So there has to be warmth and there has to be evaporation. So the only place for that to happen is D, over warm water. Number 4, in what order are hurricanes given names? Well, in class, we talked about the whopper of a hurricane season that 2020 was, and how they cycled through all the names and went on to a second source of names, and they picked those names in alphabetical order. And that's what happened in 2020 was they ran out of generated names for the storms and had to move on to a second generated list. So the answer is A, alphabetical. And number 5, which of the following catastrophic events would most likely be caused by a tsunami? Well, we know that a tsunami is a massive, massive wave caused usually by an underwater earthquake. There have actually been several of these in the news lately. There have been large underwater earthquakes in the Pacific that have put Pacific islands and islands like Hawaii on alert for floods because when that tsunami goes ashore, it causes a flood. So there you go. If you have any questions, see your science teacher.